Welcome, I'm Liz Homer, I'm the curator of the Turner Dodge House, and we're happy to see you tonight. This is the last meeting of the year of the Meet the City program, and our speaker is Val Berryman, and he is a former board member of the Friends of Turner Dodge from many years ago. And I'd say, how many, 17 I think?
No, it was more recent than that I was a board member, but I've been around for a long time.
Yeah, he's been around. And I think this year this contribution is probably going to top them all off because he is, with the help of his organization that he belongs to, the Golden Globe of Christmas Past, is decorating the house this year from the pantry to the ballroom in the different decades of the historical period of the Turner Dodge House. And so not only do you get to see the beautiful restoration of the house for the first time at Christmas time this year, but you'll also get to see just a wonderful display of Christmas memorabilia and this nostalgia. My Sonia Henry doll is here from when I was 4 years old. And so I'd like to introduce Val too. He's the curator of the MSU Museum, if I didn't mention that, and has produced many wonderful exhibits, but this is going to be my favorite. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I forgot to say one thing. The open house this year is December 7th. That's starting Saturday through the 22nd. And the hours are Wednesday through Sunday, 1 to 4. And we will have tea in the ballroom. And I should mention these ladies in the red hats. They will be helping us serve the tea. This is the Yaya chapter of the Red Hat Society. Thank you all for coming. And we will also have music in the music room on the weekends as well. And also on the weekends from 1 to 4 we'll have children's stories read by members of the Friends and Sheriff Rick Jones. And then for all the children who come, each one will receive a book from the Greater Lansing Literacy Coalition. So be sure and let people know about that. Thank you, Val.
Thanks. Well, I want to talk about Christmas in Lansing from the 1850s through the 1950s. And that's pretty much the time period that the house was occupied by the Turner and the Dodge families. And Christmas in the early years wasn't quite as big a deal as it is now. It became a legal federal holiday in the U.S. in 1856, and this allowed for the closing of schools and banks and state offices. And then the individual states legalized Christmas at various times throughout the 19th century. Here in Michigan, it became a legal holiday in 1865. But many of Michigan's settlers were New England people that still held Puritan convictions against the celebration of Christmas. And so there really wasn't much going on in Michigan in the way of Christmas celebrations in the years. And this dates back to Puritan times in England when Christmas was actually banned in the 1600s, and even things like plum pudding were outlawed because it was a popular Christmas food. Well, that ended after a while in England, but those convictions against a raucous holiday celebration of Christ's birth remained here in the United States, at least in the areas where the English settlers were. And however, in the late 1860s and 70s, immigrants from Germany, Poland, Holland, Czechoslovakia, and the Scandinavian countries began coming into this country, into Michigan specifically, and they brought their Christmas celebrations with them. In some cases, they were able to influence their neighbors, and maybe other people would start putting up a Christmas tree or talking about Santa Claus or St. Nicholas coming to visit. In other cases, their private celebrations remained that and didn't influence the people around them. Germans probably were the most influential in bringing Christmas traditions to this country. And St. Nicholas was very important, at least in the Catholic regions of Germany. And in southern Germany and in Austria, St. Nicholas was very important. He came around at Christmas time, and he has a traveling companion who, if you didn't know better, you would never guess this is a Christmas character. Because he sure looks like the devil, doesn't he? This is Krampus, and Krampus is a traveling companion for St. Nicholas in Germany and Austria. St. Nicholas brings gifts for the good children, and Krampus brings the threat of punishment for the bad children. And he has a pitchfork, he has a bundle of switches, which he'll leave behind for the children to be spanked with if they've been bad. He has a basket on his back, and the really bad children are chained up, put in the basket, and hauled away and never heard from again. So this was a pretty effective threat, at least in the last few weeks before Christmas probably, that you better be good. These are both figures that would have been sold in the Christmas markets in Germany. This one has a little extra added attraction. He can shake his chains and his switches at the kids. So, luckily, I guess, this never caught on. In the Protestant regions of Germany, they had Der Weihnachtsmann, which means the Christmas man, and that's equivalent to our Santa Claus. Because St. Nicholas is a Catholic saint, the Protestants didn't want to have anything to do with him. So they had Der Weihnachtsmann. And he's still a little grim looking. Sometimes you'll see him with a bundle of switches too, because the Germans believe in upright behavior for their children. His traveling companion was a little sweeter than Krampus, and that's Christkindl, which means the little Christ child. And the little Christ child is usually depicted as a young girl, not the baby Jesus himself, but a young girl. And she traveled with Santa Claus. Often she brought the Christmas tree, and Santa Claus would bring the gifts. And here she's riding on a deer. You'll see her on a deer, on a horse, walking with Santa Claus. Germany, in the 19th century at least, you didn't see Santa Claus in a sleigh pulled by reindeer. He was usually on foot. Sometimes he'd be pulling a little sled behind with a very small Christkindl on the sled itself. So this was a popular Christmas character, and they talk about Christkindl bringing gifts for the children. In this country, because we couldn't understand the German dialect all that well, we started calling Santa Claus Kris Kringle. And so that's where Kris Kringle comes from, Christkindl. Holland, of course, is famous for its wooden shoes, although every country in Europe at that time, the working men wore wooden shoes in the factories and in the farm fields and so forth. And the kids in Holland put out their shoe either on the hearth or at the door or at the window, and they put it out with a carrot and some hay in it for Santa's horse. Not for the reindeer, but for the white horse that he rode on. And then in the morning, the carrot and the hay would be gone, and there'd be some candies and goodies in the shoe. When the Dutch came to this country, the tradition of putting the shoe out for gifts continued, and it's just a variation of hanging the stocking up and hoping to find gifts in it in the morning. Scandinavian countries had a couple different Christmas characters. In Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, they have the Yule Nisse or the Yule Tomte. And in this country, we have one Santa Claus who serves us all. In the Scandinavian countries, each family has their own little Yule Nisse. And this is a little elfin character that lives in the barn or up in the attic, and they watch over the family pets and the family livestock, make sure that everything's going well. And all they ask for in return is a bowl of rice pudding and milk before the family has its Christmas Eve dinner. And that's what this illustration depicts. There's a big bowl there, and usually these little characters are shown with a big wooden spoon tucked in their belt. And he's finished his bowl of rice pudding. If you don't set the pudding out, you'll have problems for the rest of the year. The little Yule Nisse will play tricks on you. It'll make the milk curdle, and the only member of the family that can see the Yule Nisse is the family cat. And of course, when you set the bowl of rice pudding and milk out on the floor, the family cat's always somewhere nearby. And next morning, miraculously, the rice pudding is gone. And that's a sure indication that the Yule Nisse had been there. Another Scandinavian character is Saint Lucia, and she's very popular in Sweden. Saint Lucia was a Sicilian woman who in Roman times decided to give up her dowry. Her family had to provide a dowry to her husband's family in order for her to get married, and she was about to get married, and she had become a Christian, and she gave up her dowry and gave it away to the poor of her village. And her husband's family was so outraged that they turned her into the Roman authorities, and she was imprisoned and tortured and eventually martyred. And when Christian missionaries brought this story of St. Lucia, she died on December 13th, that's her saint's day. And when Christian missionaries brought this story to Scandinavian countries, to Sweden in particular, they really liked the story. Lucia means light, Lucy means light. And so this became the beginning of the Christmas season in Sweden. And young girls in the family, this is an actual religious icon or religious statue. And but each family who has a young girl in it, the girl will dress up in a white robe with a red sash, and she'll bring a plate of what they call Lucy buns, which are little pastries, and coffee. She'll bring that around to the members of the family very early in the morning on December 13th. And this is the start of the Christmas season for them. She wears candles in her hair and a wreath. One final piece. This is a Czechoslovakian Santa Claus, and you might not even know it was Santa, except that he has a basket of toys on his arm. This is a bank, and the German Santas and the Czechoslovakian Santas very often are just in plain brown robes. In fact, most of the time through the 19th century, Santa looked more like a monk than anything else, and brown was a very common color. So some of these traditions caught on here in this country, at least among the families that settled here, and some of them did not. But in the U.S. in general, there's several writers and artists who have helped delineate Christmas for us, and Santa Claus in particular. And they've established some nationwide traditions around Christmas. Washington Irving is probably the first and one of the most famous. He did a history of New York in 1809, which is largely mythical, but he talked about St. Nicholas, the Dutch celebration of St. Nicholas, and likened Santa or St. Nicholas to a fat, jolly Dutch burger. And so that image kind of took. Although at that time, Santa flew through the air in a wagon and dropped things down the chimneys. And this was 1809. Then in 1822, Clement Clark Moore wrote the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas. And he wrote it initially to read to his 4 children, in front of the fireplace on Christmas Eve. And then the following Christmas, the poem was printed in a Troy, New York newspaper for the first time. And in later years, 1849 to be exact, it was put out as a little publication, and this is the actual size. These are reprints. As far as I know, there's only one original, I think, that's still in existence of this particular copy of it. But these are reprints of The Night Before Christmas, what we have come to call The Night Before Christmas, which is the first line of the poem. And Moore introduced many of the characteristics of Santa Claus, the fat, jolly man dressed in fur, the reindeer in particular, and coming into the home, down the chimney, and bringing gifts and so forth. Another person who influenced our picture of Santa Claus was a German immigrant named Thomas Nast. He was a very famous political cartoonist in the 19th century. He worked for Harper's Weekly. He did illustrations during the Civil War, did illustrations of scenes on the battlefield, and was instrumental in publicizing the war and gaining sympathy for the Northern cause. But he was a German immigrant. His family he was born in Bavaria in 1840, and his family immigrated to New York when he was 6 years old. And then in 1862 he went to work for Harper's, and where his drawings of the Civil War battlefield were made. He also created the elephant, the donkey and the elephant that came to stand for the Democratic and Republican parties. He originated those symbols. And from the 1860s to the 1880s, he also created numerous drawings for Christmas. Every year he'd do several more, and did this for an extended period of time. So his artwork became very popular, very famous, and it was reprinted in a group in a book called Christmas Drawings for the Human Race. I had been looking for that book for a number of years and finally found one at an antique show, and was really excited. It didn't have a price written in it, and I asked the dealer what they wanted for it. It was $1,700. So needless to say, I didn't get it. But he created some very famous images of Santa Claus. This is probably the most well-known image of his.
I'm sorry, his name again is?
Thomas Nast, N-A-S-T. Yeah. And he did ink drawings, and then these were translated into woodcut images, and that's how they were printed in Harper's Weekly. This image, of course, you see on Christmas cards and wrapping paper and lots of things nowadays. This is one of my favorites. He used his own home and his own children as models for his drawings. And this is actually his newly born son, Cyril Nast. And this appeared in Harper's Weekly in the January 3rd, 1880 issue. It didn't appear in color. It's been hand tinted since then. And something interesting about one of his images, this is Santa Claus at the fireplace. Nast really followed Clement Clark Moore's word description almost to the letter. A right jolly old elf. He's very small. You could see he could easily come down the chimney and through that fireplace. Dressed all in fur from his head to his foot. And those of you who are up front, well, this one doesn't show it. Here he has boots on, but occasionally he'll show Santa Claus in what looks like furry little Dr. Dentons with the feet still in them. So he's literally in fur from his head to his feet. This is an interesting illustration because this is Santa Claus. This character represents the new year. And you wonder, well, what are they both doing in the picture at the same time? Well, in this illustration and several others of Nast's, he shows Santa Claus visiting on New Year's Eve, not on Christmas Eve. And this was under the influence of certain religions in this country that really wanted to separate the secular Santa Claus from the real reason for the season, the birth of Christ. And so they encouraged people to celebrate Santa Claus coming and bringing gifts on New Year's Eve. And that's what's happening here. There's a poem that goes along with this, and Santa Claus is scolding the New Year because he's coming a little bit early and Santa hasn't completed his rounds yet. Even after 1900, many rural families didn't do much to celebrate Christmas. Actually, I brought some little diaries from our collections at the museum. These are by two different members of let me get the name here. The Hardy family. And well, I can't remember the town that they're from. But if you look at the December 25th entries, Christmas Day, cloudy, ground white with snow. He patched shoes for John N. Smith, who paid him 25 cents. So he was working on Christmas Day. He was a shoemaker. Another one on the 25th worked in the sawmill on Christmas Day. And this is 1873. One for 1874. Mended Mr. Draper's boots, and he started for Ohio on a visit. Had a nice pile of sawed wood drawn up. So, not much happening. In another one, they actually did have what were apparently family members over, and somebody got 2 rocking chairs. It wasn't clear who got them, but wasn't much going on in 1873. And like I said, even by 1900, in the rural areas of this state, it might be very unusual to even have a Christmas tree in the house. The major Christmas tree would be in the town hall, in the school, in the church, and that's where the family would go to see the tree. And of course, in the schools, you had Christmas pageants. Here are a couple of pageant booklets. These were very popular. They included songs. These two are both from 1889. And They would include songs and recitations and Bible verse and so forth. Here's another one from 1929. Yeah. In Quest of Santa Claus. And again, a whole very strange story in there, as well as recitations. Kids would all play parts in it. And also, that might be where the kids would get their Christmas candy, either in Sunday school or at school itself. Came in these little boxes. These could be hung on the Christmas tree. This one still has one little kid's name, Marjorie. Got that one. And here's an earlier style. I would guess
What was in these again?
candy, hard candy. Yeah. And generally the way it worked was you'd buy these by the 100 or by the 1,000, depending on how many you were giving out. The school would do that, and then they'd buy the hard candy literally by the pail. And then you'd fill your own boxes and give them out. And this is a type of candy box that was sold through Sears, and it created a little village. If you had enough kids and got enough candy, then you could put a little village under the Christmas tree. So this came out in the 1940s.
So the animal crackers. Burn the animal crackers.
At home, the kids might put out a Christmas stocking, and more often than not, it would be the kids' own stocking. But you could also get, of course, commercially made stockings. I have a feeling that, I don't really know if that's commercially made or homemade. It could be either way. This one certainly is commercially made. And traditionally, an apple or an orange, some nuts, some hard candy, maybe one little toy in there, penny toy of some sort. And that might be all that the kids in a rural area would get. Often in reading about Christmas events in various homes, each person got one item. And they were small items, maybe a pair of mittens for somebody, a pair of socks. Lucky kid that got that. Maybe a jackknife for the boys, a fancy handkerchief for the girl, maybe a little doll or something of that sort. But generally, one gift per person. Christmas trees, of course, pine, spruce, and fir were very readily available in Michigan, and they were decorated mainly with homemade ornaments. And Michigan, of course, provided Christmas trees for lots of other areas through the Midwest and eastern states, New York, Chicago. And in fact, around the turn of the century and for many years later, there was a ship that sailed down from the Upper Peninsula to the docks of Chicago, and they would sell Christmas trees right off of the ship to the people in Chicago. Decorations were such things as popcorn strung on string, and you didn't throw those strings of popcorn away at the end of the Christmas season. You ate popcorn. Same with cookies. Decorated cookies would be hung on the tree. Cranberries. Paper chains were made. Apples, anything colorful. Apples would be hung on the tree. They would paint walnuts gold and hang those on the tree just to add a little color. And then, of course, the family could make their own ornaments, and it might be something very simple. You could buy these color lithographed and die-cut scraps by the sheet. You might get 60 Santa Claus heads in a sheet for just a few cents. And so with some pieces of tinsel, some crepe paper, some cardboard, you could make up your own ornaments. Here's one that's very creative, Santa in this kind of canoe-shaped sleigh. And they've got a Santa Claus upper body there, and then they've just added other little die-cut scraps to the piece, kind of regardless of what they are. There's a puppy sleeping in a slipper, and a pineapple and a pear and a bunch of flowers. But it makes a wonderful little Christmas tree decoration. You could also buy commercially made similar pieces. This is a cornucopia to go on the tree, which would be filled with candy and nuts and so forth. And it's made up of holly patterned paper with, again, tinsel and these die-cut scraps pasted onto it.
Do you think that one was commercial or homemade?
Probably. I've seen ones that look very much like this in some of the early catalogs, so they were available. A commercially made variation of the cornucopia is just another candy box that could be hung on the tree, but nicely printed with Christmas scenes. And this is probably right after the turn of the century. And then, of course, glass ornaments were available. The early ones were relatively simple. In fact, the first ones were just round glass balls. Very heavy. You needed a really good big tree to hang them from. They were called Kugels, which is the German word for ball, for round glass ball. And then they began to blow very thin-walled ornaments, and they became very popular and started to be exported to this country from Germany. And this is a little vase-like ornament with a tinsel handle. Here's another one that's made up to look like a balloon with Santa Claus riding in it.
How would you date that, Val?
Anywhere around 1900, early 1900s.
It's glass.
Yeah, blown glass. These were all hand blown. They didn't, these shapes in particular, they didn't use molds. That was strictly done with a gas flame and a piece of glass tube in your mouth and shaping and blowing.
Were they all frosted like that then?
Sometimes it's hard to tell whether it started life out that way. This may have, I think that probably always was frosted. But some of the ones that were silvered inside, the silvering has just disappeared, and it's not as obvious that it was bright and shiny at one time. But that looks like it started out that way. Then, of course, once you got the tree decorated, you need lights for it. And the first lights on the Christmas tree were just candles. And the earliest candle holders were just a piece of wire that might be wrapped around the base and shoved into the trunk of the tree. And then people started making all kinds of inventions to make them a little bit more safe. This is a clamp-on. This is actually earlier than the clamp-on. This just hung over the branch. And that weighted ball at the end was a decoration, but it also assured that the candle stayed upright no matter what the branch did. Because the last thing you wanted was that candle lighting the branch above it. And we think of how dangerous the Christmas tree must have been, but you have to remember that they lit the tree for a very short time on Christmas Eve and then put it out, and that was it. They didn't leave the candles burning for 2 weeks like we would leave Christmas lights burning. But nevertheless, they had a pail of water standing nearby. I've read some places they'd have a sponge on the end of a stick, so that if a branch started to flame up high, you could touch it with that wet sponge and hopefully put it out. But it's tragic to think of how many homes burned down, even with precautions. This is another inexpensive tin holder that you'd kind of interweave into the branches, and then it would hold the candle up.
What year did they start that, the candles?
Don't know when they started it because it goes back probably to the 1600s in Germany. And it would be equally difficult to say when they stopped because they haven't, at least in Germany. It's still traditional there for families to put candles on the tree. But of course, when electric lights came along, that was a much safer way of getting pretty lights on the tree and hopefully not burning the house down, although these probably did their share of that. The very first Christmas tree lights were invented not long after the electric light bulb was invented. One of Thomas Edison's workmen got the idea of putting little electric lights on the tree, and he soldered together this elaborate construction of wires that he fitted onto the tree and soldered in place, and lit up a tree, and the people from all around came to see it. And then eventually strings of Christmas lights were made. This one, this one dates to the early 1920s. And what's interesting about this box of lights, I don't have the actual lights in here, but there's a picture here showing the family enjoying the lights, and they show some of the other household sockets and so forth. And all of these work by screwing something into a light socket. They didn't have wall outlets everywhere at this time, so the best way of plugging the tree in was to screw a socket into a light fixture to light this. So that's what's at the end of the cord is something you screw into the light bulb. So that's late 20s. Noma was a big maker of Christmas lights. This is late 20s to early 30s, and this is the type of light that had a little ball on it, so that you'd slip the branch through there and then tighten that ball up to hold it in place on the tree. This is also the kind of light that if one bulb burned out, they all went out. Yeah, it's a single wire.
Is there any company that's making the bulbs for those? I mean,
I can't say that I've ever seen them. And then, right after World War II and well into the 50s, bubble lights were very popular. These came out about 1945, and Noma was the first one to put out the bubble lights. And as these heat up, there's methyl chloride, I think, is the liquid in here. It's nasty stuff. You don't want to break one of these. But when it heats up, it'll bubble inside there. And in the Christmas Collectors Club that I belong to, there are people that collect nothing but bubble lights. They're little, you can buy little artificial Christmas trees with the bubble lights built in, so they're looking for that sort of thing. By the Depression years of the 1930s, many of our Christmas traditions were pretty well established, but unfortunately the economy was going south, and people who still had money could buy nice presents because things were relatively inexpensive. But for those who couldn't spend as much on the gift, then the packaging became even more important. And in the 30s, curling ribbon was invented. I don't know if I can do this without a pair of scissors. So this came out in the 30s. Cellophane, you think of cellophane as having been around forever, but cellophane actually came out in the 1930s. This is a package wrapped from that era. or at least in the style of that era. There's actual paper underneath, that's what the pattern is printed on. But then over that is this blue cellophane wrap. And notice how it's held together with these stick-on stickers. And that was pretty much how you had to hold your gifts together for a long, long time. These were still in use well into the 50s. I remember sticking them on packages to hold the paper together. However, Scotch tape was also invented in the 1930s. And this is an early, tiny little roll of Scotch tape. In fact, this says gift wrap tape, and it has a holly pattern printed on it. The earliest Scotch tape, of course, was just clear, but it wasn't very many years before they started doing the colors. We have rolls in red and green. These are probably more likely from the 40s, but it was invented in the 30s. Here's Texel tape with Christmas greetings printed on it. So all of these things to kind of jazz up your Christmas gift, even if it was something relatively inexpensive. This is a Christmas ribbon made out of cellophane with designs printed on it. And even Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was introduced in the 1930s, well, at the very end of the 30s. This was a story or a poem, well actually it was a story that was written by Robert L. May for his children, kind of the shades of Clement Clark Moore. Wrote this poem for his kids. He worked at Montgomery Ward, and he read the poem at a Christmas party, and this was at Ward's headquarters, and he was asked to put something together using that character that they could give out as a giveaway, that Santa Claus could give out at Montgomery Ward's the following Christmas. And so he wrote it up as a poem, and I don't know if no, he didn't illustrate it. This is illustrated by Denver Gillen. But in 1939, this came out, very cheaply printed, cheap paper, and they made, I don't recall, several million. They printed several million of these and handed them out to the kids. So everyone that came to visit Santa Claus would get one of these. The next year they printed it again and did even more of them. It was very popular. But then after a while, this was 39 and 40, eventually they felt that Rudolph had had his run at Montgomery Ward's, and they gave the copyright privileges back to Robert L. May, and then Rudolph really took off because he really started merchandising him. And they continued to use him at Montgomery Ward. When I was a kid, the only time I ever remember visiting Santa Claus, I was given one of these. I was probably, this would be 1948, I would have been 8, my sister would have been about 5. And this is what Santa Claus was giving out. And you'd punch out the parts of this Rudolph, and you could put together this little cardboard Rudolph thing. And I remembered that. I remembered getting that. I don't remember what happened to it. I'm sure it didn't have a very long life. But I did remember all the years getting one of those. And when I ran across one of these at a book and ephemera show in Lansing, I was just thrilled. And eventually I bought several more. I made sure that my sister got one at Christmas. And she was kind of puzzled because she didn't remember him at all. So it didn't mean quite as much to her as it did to me. But also in 47 and 48, they did a lot of things. They did little Rudolph slippers, and there was a night light and this stuffed toy, which still has the original tag on it. And then in 1949, Johnny Marks, who was a songwriter, wrote the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And cowboy actor and singer Gene Autry introduced and recorded the song. He didn't think much of it. It was, for him, it was the B side of the record. The A side was something else. I don't know if this is it, but how many of you remember If It Doesn't Snow on Christmas? Yeah, I thought so. But this became second in popularity only to White Christmas in number of sales of records and sheet music and so forth. So this is 1949. And we won't even mention the animated Rudolph on television, which was 64, because that's out of our time period.
I wonder if his family is still getting residuals.
I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised. If they're smart, they still are. If you were out shopping in Lansing at Christmas time, you might want to make sure that you picked up your S&H green stamps. This is Sperry and Hutchinson, and they were actually, this whole stamp thing for food purchases and so forth started back in the 1890s. This is a countersign from about 1950, and here's a book of stamps from the 50s. And yeah, I remember pasting these in, and of course this would get you some more Christmas gifts. If you were a poor family like mine was, these were pretty important because you could pick up a few extra gifts. Every time you got gasoline or bought groceries, you'd get a big wad of stamps and paste them in the book. I don't recall ever being able to choose anything out of the catalog, though. My parents got stuff. And one of the only things that I could recognize on this is the Brownie Hawkeye camera, which is pictured in Santa's pack. S&H, actually the stuff that they sold was brand name, good quality pieces. So it was pretty popular. Now we're going to finish up with probably one of the most memorable images of Santa Claus. Here, I'll show this around this way. This is the work of Haddon Sunbloom, who is a Michigan native. He was born in 1899 in Muskegon, Michigan, and his father was a shipbuilder from Finland. And Sunbloom's mother died when he was 13, and the following year he left home. I think he was the oldest of 6 children, and he left home because there just wasn't enough money to support the whole family. He left home at age 14, a year after his mother died, went to Chicago, got a job there in the construction industry. You could get a work permit at 14 at that time, which would have been 1915, or 1913 rather. And eventually he began taking art classes at night and became really a very well-established commercial artist. His first work for Coca-Cola was in 1931. This is the first Santa image that he did for them, and he did artwork for Coca-Cola for the next 30 years or more, well into the 1960s. Every year he'd do a new painting of Santa Claus, And what's distinctive about Sundblom's images of Santa Claus is that they're very consistent. This character always looks the same. He's always got the snow white hair, the black eyebrows, which is very distinctive. He always shows him in, well, it doesn't show up very well here, but in brown leather, a brown belt, brown gloves, or tannish color, brown boots, and that's unusual because often Santa's shown in black. Sundblom liked to work from models, and his model for Santa Claus for a number of years was a neighbor who was a traveling salesman named Lou Prentice. And Prentice had that jolly kind of Scandinavian look, the crinkles at the eyes and so forth. But Prentice eventually died, and Sundblom wondered who he could get to serve as a model, and somebody finally said, well, take a look in the mirror because you now look like this person that you've been drawing all these years. And if you ever see a photograph of Haddon Sundblom, he looks exactly like his Santa images, although he never grew a beard, but he had pure white hair, black eyebrows, very jolly face, although I don't think he was a very jolly man in real life. This is one of his images from 1939 on the back of Saturday Evening Post. And on the front is another famous artist, Norman Rockwell, who also did lots of wonderful Santa images. But Sundblom's illustrations appeared everywhere. They appeared on all the popular magazines, National Geographic, Life magazine, Saturday Evening Post, Collier's. They also appeared as cutouts in grocery stores. This is a stand-up store counter display from 1957. And 1957 was the year that the first Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, was launched and orbited the Earth. I think it's pure coincidence that Santa Claus was shown on a rocket ship that year, although that was the start of the space race. But Sputnik went up in October, and these images would have had to have been prepared quite a bit earlier than that. Although, in actuality, the image that they used here, one of the other things that they did with Sundblom's artwork was that they could manipulate it, add things to it, shoot it in different ways, and use it in a horizontal format for a billboard, or in a vertical format for something like a calendar. So here's that same Santa Claus, and he's not in a rocket ship at all. And there's a third image where he's actually leaning against a fireplace. That arm is leaning against a fireplace mantle, and that's the way Sundblom originally painted him. But the artists at Coca-Cola could take those images and take any part of it that they wanted to. And eventually he got smart and did his images so that they could be cropped in various ways and used in many different formats. This is a calendar actually for 1958, but they always put the last month of the year before on it. So this is quite the collector's item now too.
So that he's included his own image in that one then?
Yeah, this is what he looks like. Yeah.
It's different.
Yeah.
Do you have any history on the holly? When they started using holly and why?
Not really. And then this is a Santa Claus doll. This is one of the earliest ones. You'll see them with white molded plastic boots, but this is sewn kind of vinyl, stitched vinyl, and this is probably from the 1950s. It's holding a little glass Coke bottle, which actually had liquid in it at one time. So, Sundblom's image of Santa Claus was all pervasive. You just saw it everywhere, and not only in this country but across the world, because Coca-Cola of course, was being sold around the world. So that image of Santa Claus in that outfit, the red and white outfit, became very popular. And unfortunately, it kind of drove out some of the regional Santas, the national Santas of other countries, and now you look at their Santas and they look pretty much like ours, which I think is very sad. But Sunbloom at least established this image of Santa Claus in our minds, and I think we can be very proud that he was a Michigan native, even though he only lived here for 14 years. Okay, that's the end of my talk. Are there any questions? Yes.
Val, you said that rural Michigan, 1900, most homes did not have a Christmas tree. When would they start putting them in?
I don't know, that would have been a gradual thing, although I think probably by World War II it would have been pretty well established. It really depended on how much money you had, you know, whether you could afford that sort of thing. But I don't know, it's something that would have gradually changed as people became more wealthy. And of course, the media has a big effect on that too. When you're bombarded with images of gift giving, this is what you're expected to do, then it does have an influence. Any other questions?
When did you start your collection?
In 1983, I did an exhibit here at Turner Dodge House and borrowed Santas from a number of friends of mine. And they were about a dozen people who were antique dealers, antique collectors, people from the university who had traveled to other countries and brought Santa figures back. And we filled the guest bedroom upstairs with Santa images, and it was such a fascinating collection of images that I love going to antique shops and shows and so forth, so it kind of opened my eyes to what might be out there, and I began collecting immediately and just kind of went crazy. And they're taking over the house now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, are you able to keep it in one room?
Oh no. I lost that battle years ago. Initially they were all in cabinets and closets and you didn't even see them. And now anybody that walks in the house, you know, in July and sees Santas all over the place, they think, what kind of an idiot lives here? But it has been fun, and especially looking for the foreign characters, learning about Krampus, St. Lucia, Christkindl, and then seeing what I can find. And the collection, I should say, I never started out buying it to decorate my home. My family all lives down in Florida, so I leave and go down there for Christmas. I don't even put up a Christmas tree because there's no one at home to enjoy it. So I've always been collecting strictly for Christmas exhibits that we can do anywhere in the community. And that's still...
So you collect anything Christmas then?
Well, specifically Santa Claus. I try to stay with Santa Claus and Santa, what I call Santa substitutes. So characters like Krampus and St. Lucia and so forth. And I like to be able to show how he's changed over the years and how he is different in other countries. Now that's kind of, it's branched out a little bit, you know, because I start learning about England and I learn about plum pudding, so I want to get something that represents plum pudding. And I learn about Christmas crackers and I start looking for examples of those. But it's easy to, you know, to just start collecting everything, and I try to avoid that.